Today, Dracula is considered by many to be the most important novel in the history of horror literature and a landmark in Victorian literature. But in its own day, it was not. Over time, however, Stoker's iconic Count Dracula became the foundation on which all vampire media was eventually built, and today, his novel is studied for its cultural relevance all over the world. What does a nobleman from Transylvania, who has lived for centuries, want with the people of London, England? In this legendary battle between good versus evil, death and life, will Dracula or his foes prevail? Bram Stoker was born in Dublin, Ireland on November 8, 1847. He was a sickly, bedridden child, but grew into an athletic, robust young man who studied at Trinity College in Dublin. He got married, worked as a theater manager, and began to write short horror stories. Around 1890, he began a novel which eventually was published as Dracula in 1897. Dracula did not make Stoker financially successful in his lifetime or bring him immediate literary fame. Regarded as an entertaining novel, Dracula received praise for its imaginative settings and thrilling scenes of vampirism, but it also received harsh criticism. Ironically, it wasn't until after Stoker's death in 1912 that Dracula's fame began its steady growth. Let's talk about the context for Dracula. Bram Stoker did not write the first vampire story, but was influenced by ancient vampire legends and previously published works. Stoker was also influenced by his own research into historical and travel books and legends of Transylvania. Dracula is one of several important and enduring horror stories created by Victorian authors. It has several Gothic traits such as remote and mysterious settings, innocent young women pursued by older men and are finally saved by virtuous young men, and dramatic coincidences in which fate plays a hand. However, Dracula is among a group of novels presenting change and transition. Characters' motivations become more sophisticated and conflict is connected to contemporary issues. Let's dive into the storyline. Dracula is interesting in that it essentially has no main character, but rather a set of characters. The novel opens with Jonathan Harker, a young lawyer who is traveling to Transylvania to complete property transactions with a nobleman who calls himself Count Dracula. When Harker arrives at Castle Dracula, after experiencing the beautiful countryside, but also ominous local superstition, he slowly begins to understand that his host is something far from human. Harker soon realizes he is a prisoner and that Dracula is apparently planning to travel to London, England, not to simply relocate, but possibly spread whatever evil he possesses among the populace. The story then switches to Harker's fiancée, Mina Murray, and her friend Lucy Westenra, who exchange letters about their trip to Whitby in the summer, as well as Lucy's three suitors. One, the psychiatrist named John, or Jack Seward, runs his own private asylum where an insane patient named R.M. Renfield is held, and who holds clues to Dracula's arrival. The second, Quincy Morris, is a Texan who is friends with both suitors and serves as a primary adversary against Dracula, especially during the novel's conclusion. The final, Arthur Holmwood, is a member of the English gentry and Lucy's choice for a husband, who also plays a large role in her salvation and eventually Mina's. Dracula, while Mina and Lucy are vacationing in Whitby, arrives on a ship during a terrible storm. A newspaper speaks of the event, including the captain of the ship tied dead to the wheel, a giant black dog that jumped from the ship when it crashed onto the sand, and the ship log, which reveals strange events that took place on the vessel, obviously tied to Dracula's presence, as he is resting in one of his boxes of earth inside. After the storm and the ship's arrival, Lucy begins to sleepwalk, an old habit, and starts to exhibit strange behavior, causing Mina's concern to increase, even more so because she has not heard much from Jonathan in Transylvania and fears something has happened to him. When the two young women return to London, Dracula begins to make his move, draining Lucy of life and leaving signs that suggest illness, yet do not. Dr. Seward, still in love with Lucy, eventually calls Van Helsing, who arrives from Amsterdam. Van Helsing soon understands exactly what is plaguing Lucy, but keeps the truth from the other characters as the plot builds. Lucy, unfortunately, in spite of all of Van Helsing's precautions and his knowledge of vampire lore, perishes, and he knows will soon rise again as a vampire. Seward, Morris, and especially Holmwood play a role in her salvation and eventually learn what she has become, a vampire, or as Van Helsing says, one of the undead. After her soul is freed and her vampire body destroyed, Mina and Jonathan return, now married, and learn of the events that transpired. Mina eventually consults Jonathan's diary and learns about what he experienced in Castle Dracula. Von Helsing, with her assistance, begins to amass the clues and story of Dracula's arrival, and the band of heroes, including Mina, prepare their assault on the vampire lord. Renfield, whose rambling quasi-biblical references now have meaning, tries to stop Dracula from making Mina his new slave, but perishes, and the blood he forces Mina to drink starts her transformation into a vampire. Working as quickly as they can, the band of heroes begin to locate the boxes Dracula transported to England, sterilizing the earth with Christian artifacts, which soon causes Dracula to flee back to Transylvania, likely to wait perhaps hundreds of years before preparing his next assault. The heroes, using Mina's connections to their foe, are able to chase him back to his castle, destroy his vampire slaves, bind the entrances, and then face him as he's being transported by his servants. There, in a quick ending, Dracula is slain with a knife to the throat and one through his chest, just as the sun's last rays disappear. The book ends with a summary from one of the characters in a letter, leaving the reader feeling a sense of anticlimax. There are a few important symbols in Dracula. Settings in the novel are associated with the main protagonist, Von Helsing, and the antagonist, Dracula. Castle Dracula and the villages around it form Dracula's stronghold, as well as cemeteries and ruined chapels. Conversely, modern cities are associated with the heroes and their abilities, and is where Dracula is most vulnerable, while many of the tools used have mythological or Christian associations. Next, let's review the themes. Ancient and modern knowledge play important parts in Dracula, and both are necessary to destroy the vampire lord. But knowledge also takes the form of Christian belief and overstepping one's limits, much as Dracula himself did. The novel is partly a tug-of-war for love and allegiance, which represents Victorian ideas of masculinity and femininity. Von Helsing frames the conflict in Dracula as a battle of good against evil, as well as salvation versus damnation. In its own day, Dracula was but an average success for Stoker, and he moved on to other works. If it weren't for a copyright battle with the German company Prana Film over Nosferatu in the early 1920s, Dracula may have perhaps remained in obscurity, never reaching the heights of popularity that it has today, as one of English literature's most immortal of evils and perhaps the greatest villain of all time.